Hello, welcome back. Let's continue on with passage 11. I will tell you up front that this passage does contain an argument. So what I would like you to do now is decide what the ultimate conclusion is and what the overall structure of this argument is going to be. Generally, when I think of overall structure, I think the macro shape or roughly how many independent lines of reasoning are going to converge upon the ultimate conclusion. So pause the video, think about that, and return when you're ready. Okay, so what did you decide? What is the ultimate conclusion? I think that the ultimate conclusion is stealing is morally wrong. Now, what's the overarching structure of the argument for that conclusion? Or how many independent lines of reasoning do we have converging upon that conclusion? I see three, and there are certain cues in the passage that can help me to see that there are three. Did you spot them? There is first, for one thing, for another thing, and then, and finally. So that is going to split this argument essentially into three separate lines of reasoning. So let's map them, and for fun, let's evaluate them one at a time. So, for one thing, we have laws on the books against stealing, so our culture clearly thinks that stealing is morally wrong. How many independent claims would you get out of that? Pause the video, think, and start again when you've decided. Okay. If you said one, you're probably not dividing around an inference indicator expression. So if you said one, pause the video, find the inference indicator expression, and then start again. If you said two, which is what I would have, you are dividing around the so. So we have laws on the books against stealing. That's going to be number two. So our culture clearly thinks that stealing is morally wrong. So we're going to map the relationship between 2 and 3. Think about that, pause the video, and come back when you're ready. Okay, so what did you decide? What is the relationship between 2 and 3? Is it going to be arrow, plus, or separate? Well, so is an inference indicator expression, and it works like therefore. So there's going to be an arrow between 2 and 3, and 2 is going to be on the top. So we're going to have something like this, 2 arrowed down to 3. Now, where is 3 going to go? Because this line of reasoning is finished, we know that 3 is going to go directly to the ultimate conclusion, like that. Now, you could map the entire argument and then evaluate this line of reasoning, nothing wrong with that, but just to shake things up again, let's evaluate this line of reasoning. So, pause for a moment, evaluate this line of reasoning, and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so what do you think? Suppose I were to say, I don't think that our culture does think that stealing is morally wrong. Could I just say that and be done? No, because that is attacking 3, and 3 is a sub-conclusion. So if I don't like 3, what I should do is examining the reasoning for 3. I should look at 2, and I should look at that inference arrow, A. So let's just start at the top. We have laws on the books against stealing. Is that true? I think so. I mean, by books, I mean like our regulations, our legal code. I think that stealing is illegal. Could someone believe that, even if they don't already believe the ultimate conclusion? I think they could. So it looks to me like 2 is fine. Let's evaluate inference A. Ask yourself, if Bob believes 2, how likely is Bob going to be to believe 3? Pause the video, think for a bit, and come back when you're ready. Okay, what did you think? Do you think it's good? If you do think it's good, it's probably because you think that 2 is true and you think that 3 is true. I'm just guessing. And I think that 2 is true and I think that 3 is true. Yeah, sure. But the question at hand is 2 evidence of 3? Could someone believe 2 and not believe 3? And I think they could. There's a certain way of evaluating the inference, and I'm not going to assess you on this, but it's nice to know. It's the counterexample method. What you can do is find a concept in the reason and a concept in the conclusion, in this case 2 and 3. And imagine basically doing a cut and replace. Take out that concept and put in some other concept in such a way that the reason is true and the conclusion is false. If you can do that, what you've shown is, in general, that way of reasoning might have some problems. So let's do that here. We have laws on the books against stealing. Our culture clearly thinks that stealing is morally wrong. So it looks like stealing is the concept that 2 and 3 have in common. Now let's imagine that going away. So I am just going to make this blue so we know we're going to think about stealing. Imagine replacing stealing with something else. And we want to imagine replacing it with something that would make 2 true and would make 3 false. So think about that. Can you imagine something that we do have laws against, but our culture doesn't really think is maybe morally wrong? Think about that when you've decided. Pause the video, and when you've decided, come back. Okay, well, I think that we have laws against a number of things that we don't necessarily think are morally wrong. I mean, certainly that's true of regulations in general. Like here in the United States, we are supposed to drive on the right-hand side of the road. It's illegal to drive on the left-hand side of the road unless you're passing a car, right? It's the right hand is the default lane. Well, is it immoral to drive on the left-hand side of the road? I mean, if we went to another country where they drove on the left-hand side of the road, would we think, oh my gosh, they're doing something unethical? No. We might have laws against double parking. Do we think that it's illegal to double park? No. You can probably Google a lot of just crazy laws that some cities might have that stem back from like the 1800s. Do we think that doing those things are illegal? Sure. Immoral? Maybe not. So in general, we can't go from illegal to immoral, right? So although I might think that 2 is true and I might think that 3 is true, I don't think that 2 is a reason to believe 3. If I believe 3, I believe 3 for independent reasons. Now, ask yourself, is that enough to tell us that this entire line of reasoning is bad? Pause the video, think for a bit, and come back when you're ready. It is, right? It's enough, because this line, the fact that this inference is bad means that we don't get to 3. This argument doesn't convince us of 3, and so 3 doesn't have a chance to convince us of 1. But I suppose one could say, well, that's being really picky. If we have independent reason to believe 3, and you just acknowledge that we might, couldn't we just say, well, let's just get rid of this inference and charitably read the argument and say that 3 is enough to give us 1? Let's evaluate that. Let's evaluate inference B. If Bob believed 3, how likely would Bob be to believe 1? Pause the video, think about that for a bit, and come back when you're ready. Okay, our culture thinks that stealing is morally wrong, so it is. Can you see what someone is assuming there? They're assuming that whatever our culture thinks is morally wrong is in fact morally wrong. And a cultural relativist would probably say yes to that, because they think that the culture just basically sets what's moral. But we might disagree. We might think that our culture could have it wrong. There are things that our culture previously thought were ethical that now we think maybe aren't ethical anymore, like segregation on the basis of race, for instance. And there might be things that our culture thought were ethical that we don't think are ethical now. Is that what I said? Or unethical before that we don't think are unethical now. The point is, the fact that our culture says that something is morally right doesn't necessarily mean that it's morally right. Maybe our culture is wrong. The fact that our culture says that something is unethical doesn't necessarily mean that it's unethical. Maybe our culture is wrong. So inference B is bad. So even if we have independent reasons to believe 3, that's not going to be enough. Okay, so let's take a look at the other lines of reasoning and see if they're any better. For another thing, the center line of reasoning. Stealing tends to produce unhappiness because it involves taking other people's property without their permission and because people don't like to have their property taken away. Take a look at that line of reasoning, just between the for one thing and between the for another thing and the and finally. Identify what important claims there are and map that. So pause the video, do that, and come back when you're finished. Okay, how many separate claims did you get? I see 3. And I see this because and because relationship, which is a particular pattern that's really handy to know. So one claim is stealing tends to produce unhappiness. That's one claim. That would be 4. Because, now as soon as you see the because, imagine a reason for what came before, a reason for 4. It, stealing, involves taking people's property without their permission. And because, and now you might be seeing that because of that because and because relationship, what follows will be added to 5 to give us 4. And because people don't like to have their property taken away. There we go. So mapping that, what we would have is 4, stealing tends to produce unhappiness because it involves taking people's property and because people don't like that. Good. And then 4 goes directly to 1. How do I know that? Well, because that line of reasoning is over. The next thing is going to be the and finally the third line of reasoning. So we have inference C and we have inference D. Take a moment, evaluate that, pause the video, and when you've decided, come back. Okay, I see a problem here, and I see a problem with one of the inferences. Right? I think it's inference D. When we go from 4 to 1, basically what we're assuming is that things that produce unhappiness are wrong, right? That's what's being assumed. But in general, is that the case? Vaccinations might produce unhappiness in the kid who's being vaccinated. Does that make it wrong? Probably not. Desegregating schools probably produced unhappiness for the people who didn't want them desegregated. Does that mean that it's morally wrong? No. So we can't go from the fact that stealing produces unhappiness to stealing's morally wrong. Doesn't work. Now, it might look like it works because I might have independent reason to believe 4 and independent reason to believe 1, and so there can be this illusion that 4 is evidence for 1, but it's not. The fact that something produces unhappiness is not in and of itself reason to believe that something's morally wrong. At least I don't think so. Okay, so is that enough to tell us that this line of reasoning is bad? Think about that. Pause the video and come back when you've decided. It is, right? Because one inference bad in a line of reasoning takes out that entire line of reasoning. But fear not, we have one more line left. So let's take a look at that. And finally, God is the ultimate source of moral value, which means that if an action is accordance with the will of God, then it's morally unobjectionable. But the eighth commandment is an explicit injunction or prohibition or rule against stealing, from which it follows that stealing is in fact a violation of the will of God. So this is going to be a much more complicated line of reasoning, I think. Think about that for a bit. First, find the first two claims, just two claims, and map the relationship between them. Pause the video and come back when you're ready. Okay. First two claims in the third line of reasoning. God is the ultimate source of moral value is one, which means that is an inference indicator expression, so we have to divide there. If an action is in accordance with the will of God, then it's morally fine. Now, I'm going to resist the temptation to read on here because I want to represent the relationship between 7 and 8 first. That will allow me to think of them as one thing, and it's just going to be more efficient. This is part of the chew your food principle. So will 7 and 8 be related with an arrow, a plus, or 7? Well, because of the which means that, that's going to be an arrow, right? And which means that is like therefore. So it's going to be 7, which means that 8. Good. Now let's continue on. But the eighth commandment is an explicit injunction against stealing, from which it follows that stealing is in fact a violation of the word of God, will of God. Okay. Now we have a claim. Do we have more than one claim? I tell you what, take a look at just this last sentence and figure out how many claims there are in it and number those claims. Don't do anything else. Pause the video, do that, and come back. Okay, I see 2, right? There is this claim. The eighth commandment is an explicit injunction against stealing. And then the from which it follows that is an inference indicator expression. Stealing is a violation of the will of God, is the other claim. Okay, now we have a decision to make. Should we, on the one hand, take a look at 9 and ask, how is 9 related to the 7 and 8 bit? Or should we represent the relationship between 9 and 10 first, right? So should we, 1, figure out how 9 is related to 7 and 8? Or should we, 2, figure out how 9 is related to 10? Pause the video, think about that, and come back when you've decided. Okay, normally, right, normally I would say, take a look at the 9 and weave it in, because generally speaking, we want to use ideas as soon as we have them, incorporate them into our understanding of the argument up until that point. But there's an exception, and the exception is when we see an inference indicator expression. Let's represent that right away. And I do here, I see the from which it follows that. So what's the relationship between 9 and 10? Pause the video, think about that, come back when you're ready. Okay, from which it follows that is like therefore. So 9 is a reason to believe 10. 10 follows from 9. So let's write that. And I'm just going to write it over here in some, just separate from the rest, because I don't want to prejudice how this thing, the 9-10 bit, is going to be related to the 7-8 bit. think about that. Would it be related with an arrow, with a plus, or separate? Just that, just the shape. Are the 7 and 8 and the 9 and the 10 related with an arrow, a plus, or separate? Pause the video, think about that, and come back. Okay, I think it's going to be a plus, right? I mean, for one thing, if they were separate, then we would have 4 lines of reasoning, and we don't. Also, there is the but here, and but is usually a plus, so they're going to be related with a plus. So what's going to be added to what? Think about that. If you were to add the 7 and the 8 and the 9 and the 10 together, right? What claims would you add together? Which are the dependent reasons here? Okay, let's think about it. The most natural thing, I think, is to add 8 and 9 because they are right next to each other in the passage. And it might work out really well that way. So let's imagine that. Let's imagine 8 and 9 added together. If an action is in accordance with the will of God, then it's morally fine. Okay. The 8th commandment is an injunction against stealing. Therefore, stealing is a violation of the will of God. That's what we would get if we added the 8 and the 9. But I don't think that the 9 needs 8's help. I mean, I'm not too sure what would follow from 8 and 9. Let's think. If an action is in accordance with the will of God, then it's morally unobjectionable. The 8th commandment is an injunction against stealing. I don't see that 10 is what would follow from 8 and 9. But the more I look at 8 and 9 and 10, I think I see 2 other claims that do go together. Take a look at 8 and 10. Do they have something in common that would allow us to connect them in this puzzle piece way? If an action is in accordance with the will of God, then it's morally unobjectionable. Stealing is a violation of the will of God. Yeah, they're both talking about the will of God, correct? So I think that 9 arrowed to 10 is connected to the 7 arrowed to 8 by adding the 8 and the 10. That is not easy to see. Can you see why that's hard to see? It's hard to see because the 10 is separated from the 8 by 9. In terms of how this passage is written, that's a problem. It's a problem with the way this passage is written. I did it on purpose because I wanted to make this point, but if I were to write it with the goal not of making a point about how to explain how to map an argument like this, but to make it perfectly easy for my reader to follow, I probably wouldn't do that. I would write, I would maybe say 10 before I say 9, and then connect them with a because rather than a therefore. Okay, so here we have it. Inference A, not inference A, this would be what? This would be A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. I would like you to evaluate inference G. So pause the video, think for a bit, and come back when you're ready. Okay, what did you decide? I think before I ask you what you decide, I'm going to ask you, how did you decide? Did you do something like the Bob test? Did you think, okay, so imagine that 8 is true, or imagine someone believes 8, and imagine that someone believes 10. How likely are they going to be to believe 1? Not necessarily wrong to do that. The Bob method always works if we are completely rational, but we aren't always completely rational. So we should use the inference forms when we can. Can we here? Well, we have an if-then, and we have another claim that is probably related to the if-then as the front, the back, the opposite of the front, or the opposite of the back. So if that's not how you thought about the inference, I want you to think about it again that way. Pause the video, think, come back when you're ready. Okay, let's evaluate inference G using the inference forms. So before we do that, we need to figure out what the front part is. The front part of this if-then is an action is in accordance with the will of God. That's the front part. So I will make that, I don't know, purple. Well, that doesn't show up. I'll make it red. And the back part is, it's morally unobjectionable. I'll make that kind of a green. Okay. Now let's compare that to 10. Stealing is in fact a violation of the will of God. Is that more like the front or more like the back? Just that, which is it more like, the front or the back? Pause, think, come back when you're ready. It's more like the front, right? Because the front talks about something being a violation of the will of God, or it's somehow the will of God, right? The back part doesn't talk about the will of God at all. So is 10 then exactly the front part, or is it the opposite of the front part? Think about that, pause the video, and come back when you're ready. Well, the front part is an action is in accordance with the will of God. This says that stealing is a violation of the will of God. That looks like the opposite of the front. So think about what's going on here. We have an if-then claim, and we're adding to it the opposite of the front part. Are we concluding the opposite of the back? Let's double check. The back is stealing is morally unobjectionable, morally fine. The conclusion, though, 1, is stealing is morally wrong. So indeed, that's exactly what we're doing. We're going from if front, then back, and the opposite of the front to the opposite of the back. Is that inference form valid or not? Pause the video, think a bit, and come back when you're ready. What do you think? Right? If it did work, it would be like saying, if Max is a poodle, then Max is a dog. Sure. Max is not a poodle, opposite of the front. And concluding that Max is not a dog, but we can't do that because there's lots of different kinds of dogs. That's the fallacy of negating the antecedent. So, nope. Inference G is bad. Now, is that enough to tell us that this line of reasoning is bad? Oh, indeed it is, right? Because that's one line of reasoning. If one line of reasoning has a bad inference or a bad premise, that whole thing, that line of reasoning is bad. Now, can we pronounce upon the goodness or badness of the argument as a whole? We can. What is it, good or bad? It's bad. It's bad because none of these lines of reasoning support the ultimate conclusion. What does that tell us about the ultimate conclusion itself? Can we say, oh, this argument is bad, so the conclusion must be false and stealing must be fine? Can we do that? No. The fact that an argument is bad only tells us that it does not give us reason to believe that the ultimate conclusion is true. It doesn't follow that the ultimate conclusion is false, right? Not being provided with evidence in an argument, in this particular argument, for the truth of the conclusion is not enough to have us decide that the conclusion must then be false. We might have independent reason to think the conclusion is true, just not this argument. Very good. By the way, if you take a look at this argument, you'll see that these lines of reasoning get increasingly complex. It might be entirely possible at this point that you can do this leftmost line of reasoning in your head without even numbering a claim, without mapping, just tracking it mentally. And that, by the way, is where this skill of mapping arguments proves its worth, because the goal is to internalize these skills enough so that when you're faced with relatively short arguments, you can track it mentally. But then, as these lines of reasoning get more complex, you might reach a point where you actually do want to take something out and, like a napkin or something, and map that line of reasoning or that argument and evaluate it with the map before you. But you don't always have to. You will get to the point where, if you haven't already, you can do a lot of this stuff in your head, and that's where this really, really proves its worth. Okay, that's it for now. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.